The horn split the storm like iron on bone, and the village woke in terror as waves beat the pier. Erik Thorne said, "That is the dragon's last roar." Lightning mapped the cliffs and showed smoke rising from the long hall. A shadow moved on the palisade, and a gate bar lifted without a sound. Erik Thorne said, "Someone opened us to the sea." Longships slid from the dark with painted eyes that never blinked. Jarl Magnus raised his crimson banner, and torches rained on wet thatch. Old Gunnar muttered a prayer, and the wind answered with ash. Leif Calder said, "We run, or we drown in steel." Erik Thorne said, "We stand, or the dead will judge us." The horn cried again, deeper, like stone remembering fire. Astrid Vale stepped from smoke and did not meet his eyes. She slipped away as chains clattered on the docks. Erik Thorne said, "This night brands us all." Thunder rolled, and the shore breathed fear. Dawn bled gray over the bay, and the long hall's roof hissed where rain kissed embers. Erik Thorne said, "I left to keep my oath, and ruin kept pace." He stepped through the broken door, and the smell of pine pitch felt like grief. Old Gunnar leaned on his staff and traced a circle in wet ash. Old Gunnar said, "The horn called something older than Magnus." Erik Thorne said, "A traitor cut the bar." Gunnar nodded as if the sea had spoken the same. Leif Calder said, "Tracks lead from the gate to the cliff steps." Erik Thorne touched the splintered beam and closed his eyes. He remembered a laugh in dark halls, and a promise that bent like hot iron. Erik Thorne said, "If the roar ends, the dead might sleep." Rain pattered, patient and cold. The lane sloped to the docks, and footprints pooled with rain where the mud kept its secrets. Leif Calder said, "3 sets, light on the toes, fast." Erik Thorne said, "Raid scouts and one who knows our paths." A gull wheeled and cried like a warning that came too late. Old Gunnar tapped the earth and shook his head. Old Gunnar said, "This ground lies to spare a guilty heart." Erik Thorne said, "The gate opened from within." He stared at the cliff steps and saw smoke cling like a wounded thing. Leif Calder said, "Magnus will circle back for prisoners." Erik Thorne said, "Then we break his circle." The rain thinned, and the wind carried pitch and salt. The horn was silent, but the echo lived in bone. They took shelter beneath a cliff where lichens mapped old stories on stone. Old Gunnar drew the dragon rune with a wet stick. Old Gunnar said, "When the horn cries a third time, a crown will crack." Erik Thorne said, "Magnus wears his crown inside his scars." The sea sighed and retreated like a beast thinking. Leif Calder said, "If this is prophecy, it has teeth." Old Gunnar's gaze traveled to the dark steps that climbed the bluff. Old Gunnar said, "The path turns where a liar chose it." Erik Thorne said, "Names change, debts remain." He wrapped the wolf pelt tighter as wind needled the wet seams. The cliff face wept thin rivulets that tasted of rust and time. Astrid Vale stepped from the stair shadow with a hood that drank the light. "Astrid Vale," said Magnus, left a net on the north road. Erik Thorne said, "Whose ropes bind it?" She let the question pass and studied the tide. Astrid Vale said, "He hunts your mentor first." Old Gunnar did not flinch, as if he had waited to be hunted. Leif Calder said, "She was at the gate." Astrid Vale's jaw set like a door closing. Astrid Vale said, "Do you want a map or a sermon?" Erik Thorne said, "I want truth." The wind rose, scattering rain into knives. Astrid Vale, said Truth, travels with me if you dare to walk. The stair behind her creaked as if someone else had paused. The rain softened, but Erik Thorne carried the storm inside. He traced the scar on his cheek and whispered to the silent horn. Erik Thorne said, "I wore exile like a chain, but chains still break skin." Old Gunnar leaned on his staff, his eyes dim with age, but fierce with memory. Old Gunnar said, "Exile was a scar, not a sentence." Leif Calder shifted, uncertain, his torch smoke curling upward. Leif Calder said, Your shame was the village's shame too. Astrid Vale stepped closer, her hood dripping, gaze sharp. Ah, Astrid Vale said, the shame makes you dangerous. That is why Magnus fears you. The wind tugged the wolf pelt tighter around Erik's shoulders, and guilt pressed harder than rain. They gathered in the shelter of an overturned boat, waves licking the keel. Old Gunnar said, prophecy binds more tightly than iron. Erik Thorne clenched his jaw, anger bitter as salt. Erik Thorne said, I bled for a crown that spat me out. Old Gunnar placed his hand on Erik's arm, steady as stone. Old Gunnar said, the horn calls only those who dare rise again. Leif Calder nodded, his freckles streaked with rain. Leif Calder said, then we follow its cry until our bones break. Astrid Vale lingered in silence, her gaze veiled, her lips curving in the faintest hint of something unreadable. The sea sighed, carrying omens across the tide. Fire crackled weakly as they lit driftwood in a stone ring. Leif Calder's face flickered between light and shadow. Leif Calder said, I was a boy when Magnus burned my kin. He stared into the flame as if it whispered names. Erik Thorne said, you chose me though I failed my own blood. Leif Calder shook his head, firm in conviction. Leif Calder said, you fight with regret. That makes you stronger than pride. Old Gunnar coughed, the sound like gravel. Old Gunnar said, regret can carve paths sharper than swords. Astrid Vale lifted her eyes to the horizon, but her silence hummed louder than words. The tide receded, exposing black rocks, sharp as teeth. Astrid Vale walked ahead, her cloak trailing like a shadow. Erik Thorne said, you knew the gate would fall. Astrid Vale turned, eyes catching faint light. Astrid Vale said, knowledge is not guilt. Her tone was velvet over steel. Leif Calder spat on the rocks. Leif Calder said, you speak like the traitors who fed Magnus. Astrid Vale's lips curved in a half smile. Astrid Vale said, perhaps I speak like one who survives. Old Gunnar raised his hand for silence, the sea echoing his gesture. The waves withdrew, and secrets clung to the stones like barnacles. Far across the bay, Jarl Magnus stood in his war tent, banners damp with mist. His hands tightened on a sword, scarred by battles past. Jarl Magnus said, the exile rises, but he will break again. His voice was a growl wrapped in silk. A young raider bowed, trembling. Raider said, the village burns, my Jarl. Yet the horn cried once more. Magnus's gaze hardened, a fire beneath ice. Jarl Magnus said, then the traitor earns his keep. Bring me Gunnar first. He raised his crimson cloak and closed his fist. Jarl Magnus said, fear will be my crown. The tent snapped in the wind like thunder's echo. Smoke still drifted from the ruined huts, and the air smelled of wet ash. Erik Thorne tightened his wolf-pelt cloak and stared at the cliff path. Erik Thorne said, Magnus hunts with fire, but he fears the horn more than steel. Leif Calder kicked charred timber into the mud. Leif Calder said, he will bleed us with patience. Astrid Vale leaned against a broken post, her eyes unreadable. Astrid Vale said patience is sharper than rage. Old Gunnar tapped his staff on the earth. Old Gunnar said, a curse is not patience, it feeds until it bursts. Thunder murmured far off, and the village lay heavy with dread. They climbed the cliff path, jagged stones slick with rain, the sea roaring below. Leif Calder said, this way leads to Magnus's scouts. Erik Thorne gripped the rocks, his boots scraping. Erik Thorne said, then we meet them before they meet us. Astrid Vale followed, her movements graceful despite the wet stone. Astrid Vale said, scouts kill quick and leave whispers. Old Gunnar steadied himself, breath ragged, his eyes on the storm clouds. Old Gunnar said, the higher we climb, the clearer the truth cuts. The path narrowed, and the sound of steel above hinted at danger waiting. Steel rang as 3 scouts leapt from the ridge, blades flashing in gray light. Leif Calder raised his axe, sparks leaping from the first clash. Erik Thorne said, "Hold the path or we all fall." Astrid Vale drew her curved dagger and moved like smoke, striking fast. Old Gunnar braced against the stone, chanting a prayer lost in wind. One scout's blade grazed Erik's arm, and blood mixed with rain. Erik Thorne said, "Blood pays for honor." Light pressed them close to the edge, the sea clawing at their feet. Two scouts lay broken on the rocks, the third crawling back toward the ridge. Leif Calder said, "He runs to Magnus." Erik Thorne stepped forward, pressing his sea axe to the man's throat. Erik Thorne said, "Tell him exile carries teeth." The scout spat blood, defiance sharp thought. "Scout," said Magnus, "wears your shame as his crown." Astrid Vale's eyes flickered, unreadable as she watched. Old Gunnar whispered, "Pride poisons truth." Erik Thorne hesitated, then cut the scout's throat clean. The wind tore the cry away, and silence returned sharper than steel. They reached the ridgetop, and the land opened into dark pines, heavy with mist. Erik Thorne said, "Magnus draws us deeper than fire or steel." Astrid Vale scanned the tree line. Astrid Vale said, "Forests hide more than wolves." Leif Calder tightened his grip on the axe, his breath fogging. Leif Calder said, "Then let the wolves meet wolves." Old Gunnar's staff thudded against roots. Old Gunnar said, "The forest holds answers, but it devours those who enter without truth." Erik Thorne's scar burned in the cold, and the silence pressed heavy as unseen eyes watched. The forest closed in, branches dripping, the air thick with pine and damp earth. Erik Thorne pushed through the mist, his scar aching. Erik Thorne said, "This silence is a blade." Astrid Vale walked just ahead, her hood down, raven hair damp. Leif Calder muttered, "Too quiet. Even wolves breathe louder." Old Gunnar touched the bark of a tree, fingers tracing runes cut deep. Old Gunnar said, "These marks are warnings, carved by kin long buried." Erik Thorne said, "Magnus follows the old paths." The fog shifted, shapes moving unseen between the trunks, and dread curled tighter than the cold. From the fog stepped a figure cloaked in furs, eyes like embers under a shadowed hood. Erik Thorne froze, hand on sea axe. Stranger said, "The horn was not yours to sound." Astrid Vale lowered her gaze, lips tight as if she already knew. Leif Calder lifted his axe, stance wide. Leif Calder said, "Speak or bleed." Old Gunnar's breath caught, voice shaking. Old Gunnar said, "This is the outsider of the prophecy." Erik Thorne said, "Then let him speak, before silence kills us." The stranger's laugh was brittle as ice. Stranger said, "One of you carries Magnus's crown in secret." The outsider lowered his hood, scars mapping his face, eyes sharp with secrets. Outsider said, "Magnus bleeds this land, but not alone. The gate opened with hands you trust." Erik Thorne's jaw clenched as he turned toward Astrid Vale. She met his gaze, calm, her amber eyes unflinching. Astrid Vale said, "You seek traitors in every shadow." Leif Calder shouted, "She was at the gate." The forest echoed the accusation. Old Gunnar said, "Truth does not need torches, it burns itself." Erik Thorne said, "Then burn it now." The outsider smiled grimly, silence heavier than words. Astrid Vale stepped forward, cloak falling back, her dagger glinting. Astrid Vale said, "Yes, I unbarred the gate." The forest seemed to stop breathing. Leif Calder snarled, rage burning in his freckles. Leif Calder said, "You led them to slaughter." Astrid Vale's eyes hardened, voice cutting. Astrid Vale said, "I chose survival. Magnus promised my kin freedom." Erik Thorne's chest tightened, betrayal carving deeper than any blade. Erik Thorne said, "You traded blood for chains." Old Gunnar whispered, "Betrayal is prophecy's shadow." The outsider watched, lips curved in grim satisfaction as the group splintered. Silence fell, broken only by rain dripping through pine needles. Erik Thorne stared at Astrid Vale, torn between rage and memory. Erik Thorne said, I trusted you beyond blood. Astrid Vale sheathed her dagger with a calm smile. Astrid Vale said, trust is a weapon, and I used it well. Leif Calder's axe trembled as he struggled not to strike. Old Gunnar said, this fracture feeds Magnus more than steel. The outsider's voice was low, final. Outsider said, now you see, the enemy does not come from the sea alone. It walks beside you. The fog closed, swallowing the clearing like a grave. The forest broke into a cliff plateau, the sea roaring far below. Jarl Magnus stood there with his crimson cloak snapping like flame. Jarl Magnus said, exile returns to choke on his shame. Erik Thorne's jaw clenched, hand tightening on his sea axe. Erik Thorne said, your crown is built on lies and blood. Astrid Vale lingered at Magnus's side, her gaze sharp with betrayal. Leif Calder raised his axe, rage surging. Leif Calder said tonight, blood answers blood. Old Gunnar's staff struck stone, sparks leaping. Old Gunnar said, this is the hour prophecy clause free. The storm cracked above, thunder screaming their fate. Magnus's warband emerged from the trees, shields gleaming with wet firelight. Erik Thorne stepped forward, his scar a brand in the lightning. Erik Thorne said, I carry exile no longer. Magnus laughed. The sound cold. Jarl Magnus said, you carry death. Leif Calder swung first, his axe biting into the shield wall. Sparks showered, cries rising. Astrid Vale's eyes flickered, as if caught between loyalty and regret. Old Gunnar lifted his staff high, voice echoing a chant. Old Gunnar said, horn of ash, bind the circle. The war band roared, rushing like a tide of iron. The clash thundered, steel on steel, rain sizzling on hot blood. Leif Calder struck down one foe, but another slashed his arm. Leif Calder said, pain fuels the axe. Erik Thorne cut through the line, his eyes locked on Magnus. Erik Thorne said, your crown ends here. Magnus swung his sword, sparks exploding as blades met. Jarl Magnus said, exile has no throne. Astrid Vale darted between shadows, her dagger finding gaps in armor. Old Gunnar staggered, coughing, but his chant did not break. The storm howled, drowning every cry in fury. Leif Calder fell to one knee, his axe buried in a foe. Erik Thorne turned, rage carving his face. Erik Thorne said, stand, brother, we are not done. Leif Calder coughed, blood mixing with rain. Leif Calder said, I will not fall before you. Astrid Vale's dagger struck an enemy from behind, her eyes finding Erik's for a heartbeat. Astrid Vale said even betrayal cuts both ways. Magnus lunged his sword tearing Erik's cloak, steel grazing skin. Jarl Magnus said, your scar will be your grave. Old Gunnar cried out, voice breaking, the third roar is here. Lightning split the sky. The horn sounded, though no hand touched it, echoing from the cliffs like thunder born of stone. Magnus faltered, his sword lowering. Jarl Magnus said, the crown cracks. Erik Thorne's sea axe struck, biting deep, Magnus roaring as blood spilled. Astrid Vale cried out, torn between rage and fear. Astrid Vale, said Magnus, cannot fall, not now. Leif Calder dragged himself upright, voice hoarse. Leif Calder said, he falls and we rise. Old Gunnar sank to his knees, tears mixing with rain. Old Gunnar whispered, prophecy is ash, yet ash feeds flame. Lightning blinded them, and the roar shook the sea. Magnus fell against the stone, his sword clattering into the storm. His crimson cloak spread like blood on the wet plateau. Erik Thorne stood over him, chest heaving, sea axe dripping red. Erik Thorne said, exile ends here. Magnus's eyes dimmed, lips curling in bitter defiance. Jarl Magnus said, crowns break, but fear lingers. His breath rattled, then stilled. Astrid Vale turned away, rain masking her tears. Astrid Vale said, I chose wrong, and wrong chose me. Leif Calder limped closer, his arm bound in cloth. Leif Calder said, Magnus burns no more. Old Gunnar's voice shook as he lifted his staff. Old Gunnar said, the horn has spoken its last. The storm eased, leaving mist that clung to the cliffs like a shroud. Erik Thorne knelt, pressing his hand to the stone dark with Magnus's blood. Erik Thorne said, a life of shame ends with his fall. Leif Calder stood beside him, steady despite wounds. Leif Calder said, your shame forged our victory. Astrid Vale's voice cracked as she spoke. Astrid Vale said, I betrayed you, yet I struck with you. Old Gunnar closed his eyes, whispering into the mist. Old Gunnar said, prophecy devoured itself, and what remains is choice. The silence after battle weighed heavier than swords. They descended the ridge, the sea calmer, waves lapping against scarred shores. The village lay in ruin, huts charred to skeletons. Erik Thorne said, we rebuild or we vanish. Leif Calder carried his axe like a crutch, yet his stride held strength. Leif Calder said, we carve a home from ash. Astrid Vale followed, her hood low, silence heavy. Old Gunnar stopped at the broken horn resting on the ground. Anilbli. Old Gunnar said, it will never sound again, yet its echo binds us still. Erik Thorne lifted the horn, cracked and blackened, and set it on the long hall's step. They lit pyres along the shore, flames painting the sea in orange light. Erik Thorne said, honor the dead, for they carried us here. Leif Calder cast a broken shield into the fire. Leif Calder said, their courage lies in smoke. Astrid Vale dropped her dagger into the flames, her eyes wet. Astrid Vale said, let betrayal burn with it. Old Gunnar raised both hands, the firelight glowing on his lined face. Old Gunnar said, ash feeds tomorrow. The waves shimmered, carrying sparks into night, and grief mingled with the crackle of flames. The night grew still, smoke curling into the stars. Erik Thorne stood alone at the pier, watching the horizon. Erik Thorne said, exile shaped me, but the roar made me whole. Footsteps approached, Leif Calder at his side, leaning but unbroken. Leif Calder said, you are no exile now. Astrid Vale lingered in the shadows, her face unreadable, her silence an unspoken vow. Old Gunnar sat near the pyre, his staff across his knees. Old Gunnar whispered, the circle closes, but another begins. The tide rolled in gentle, as if the sea itself sighed in relief. The fires on the shore dimmed into embers, and the sky above the sea turned black velvet, stars scattered like shards of forgotten crowns. Erik Thorne walked among the ashes of the fallen, his wolf pelt cloak dragging through wet sand. Erik Thorne said, exile forged me, but exile does not bury me. His voice trembled with the weight of battles carved into scars. Leif Calder limped beside him, his axe strapped across his back, though his wounds bled fresh through cloth. Leif Calder said, Magnus burned my kin, but tonight his fire dies with him. Astrid Vale stood apart, her hood pulled low, the ocean breeze whipping strands of raven hair across her face. Astrid Vale said, I betrayed trust, and still stood at your side when the crown cracked. Old Gunnar sat by the shattered horn, his staff laid across his knees as if the weight of prophecy pressed it into stone. Old Gunnar said, the horn roared thrice, and so the circle ends. A gull cried sharp against the silence as the tide stretched long fingers into the ruins of boats. The village's ruins whispered in smoke, and the broken long hall cast jagged shadows across the mud. Erik Thorne touched the blackened beam where Magnus's banner once hung. Erik Thorne said, his fear was my shadow, and now the shadow is gone. Leif Calder leaned on a post, his freckles dulled by soot, yet his eyes burned with fierce resolve. Leif Calder said, the dead gave their names so we could carry the living. Astrid Vale stepped into the long hall, her hand brushing scorched wood as if she sought forgiveness from the walls themselves. Astrid Vale said, the gate was my sin, but I choose to build a door instead. Old Gunnar followed, his staff echoing against the stone floor, his breath heavy with age and grief. Old Gunnar said, "Prophecy binds only those who bow to it, and we bow no longer." The silence of the long hall held them as if it listened, the ashes of memory rising in tiny spirals like ghosts set free. At dawn the horizon burned gold, yet the sea stayed iron gray, waves dragging remnants of ships into the deep. Erik Thorne stood on the pier, the broken horn in his hand, its cracks glistening with salt. Erik Thorne said, "The roar is spent, yet the silence still speaks." Leif Calder joined him, his arm bound tight, his gaze steady on the water. Leif Calder said, "We sail again, but not for conquest, for remembrance." Astrid Vale lingered at the pier's edge, her dagger gone, her hands bare, as if unarmed against herself. Astrid Vale said, "I walk where your eyes still doubt me, but my steps remain with you." Old Gunnar placed his hand on Erik's shoulder, his lined face soft in dawn's first light. Old Gunnar said, "Ash feeds tomorrow, but tomorrow must be sown with choice." The tide washed over the stones, as if the sea itself bowed to the end of prophecy. In the forest clearing where betrayal was spoken, the runes glistened with dew as if washed clean by storm. Erik Thorne traced one rune with his scarred hand. Erik Thorne said, "This was written for chains, but I carve it free." Leif Calder leaned against a tree, exhaustion etched deep, yet his voice steady. Leif Calder said, "We are not prisoners of prophecy, we are its thieves." Astrid Vale knelt in the moss, pressing her palm flat against the rune-marked earth. Astrid Vale said, "I bend truth to Magnus, yet truth bends no more." Old Gunnar lifted his staff, voice trembling with both pride and sorrow. Old Gunnar said, "You walk beyond prophecy, and so you walk beyond me." His eyes glistened, the fire within them fading like the last spark of the pyres. The wind stirred the forest, carrying the last echoes of the horn. As night returned, the sea whispered beneath a starless sky. Erik Thorne stood on the pier alone, the cracked horn resting at his feet, his scar glistening pale under moonlight. Erik Thorne said, "The dragon roared thrice, and now its silence crowns me." He closed his eyes, the tide brushing his boots, carrying the weight of exile away. Astrid Vale emerged from the shadows, her face unreadable, her voice quiet. Astrid Vale said, "Trust may never return, yet I walk beside you still." Leif Calder's steps echoed, firm though limping, his axe strapped across his back. Leif Calder said, "No exile, no crown, only kin who stand when storms break." Old Gunnar sat at the pier's edge, his staff across his knees, his voice fading like the tide. Old Gunnar said, "Ash becomes soil, soil bears flame, and flame bears memory." The sea grew still, and the silence of the dragon's last roar hung eternal, echoing through them all.